Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. The following podcast episode is a modified excerpt from the Appendix, 9/11 and Epistemic Authorities, taken from the book Conspiracy Theories and the Failure of Intellectual Critique, published in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen. This excerpt focuses on the reliability of the National Institute of Standards and Technology regarding the destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7 of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001.
NIST and the World Trade Center Catastrophe. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is the agency that conducted the most extensive official analysis of the destruction of the three World Trade Center skyscrapers that collapsed on September 11, 2001. How reliable should we take their investigation into the collapse of these buildings to be? On the credibility of Shyam Sunder and John Gross. NIST is an agency under the direction of the executive branch. So, for the duration of the investigation in question, it was an arm of the Bush administration, which had been credibly accused of politicizing science, by 15,000 scientists. Shyam Sunder was NIST's lead investigator for the investigation of the World Trade Center disaster, and John Gross was a project leader for the structural fire response and collapse analysis involving the Twin Towers and Building 7. As we will see, they have both made false or misleading statements that, at least to some degree, undermine their credibility and thus the credibility of the NIST reports. Regarding the collapse of the Twin Towers, Shyam Sunder states, quote, "Clearly, buildings are not designed to withstand airplane impacts," unquote. But that's not true. Some buildings are designed to withstand airplane impacts, and the buildings under discussion are among them. More specifically, the Twin Towers were designed to withstand the impact of a Boeing 707. In an interview that took place on January 25, 2001, Frank DeMartini, an architect who was the WTC on-site construction manager, discussed the robustness of the Twin Towers in reference to the 1993 bombing of the North Tower. DeMartini stated,
"The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid. And the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting."
We can debate the differences between a 707 and a 767, and whether the speeds of the planes that hit the towers were higher than what was contemplated by the designers, and whether or not the designers would have neglected to consider the jet fuel that would be on the plane, and so on. But it is just plain false to suggest that the buildings were not designed to withstand airplane impacts. And since Sunder was a lead investigator into the cause of the WTC collapses, it is hard to believe that he did not know this. Perhaps he just misspoke. But it is a strange thing to mistakenly assert knowing both its relevance and falsity. Thus, we have a reason already to find that Sunder's credibility is at least somewhat questionable. John Gross has made similarly confidence-undermining statements. For example, Gross denied that he was aware of anyone who had claimed to have seen a pool of molten steel at the base of the towers. A questioner, who later identifies himself as Mark, engaged him saying, quote, "I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers," unquote. Gross responded flippantly,
"I am too. Please tell me about it. Have you seen it?"
After Mark responds, trying to explain the various other kinds of corroborating evidence, such as video of the South Tower shortly before its collapse, Gross makes a specific denial.
"Let's go back to your premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who says so, nobody who has produced it."
The size of the supposed pool is not at all clear, and the word pool may not trace back to any verbatim witness report. But there are many well-known eyewitness accounts of molten metal, often identified as steel, as well as corroborating evidence of various kinds. Richard Gage offers a concise summary of accounts of molten steel in a formal letter to NIST. He writes,
Mark Loiseau, president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, who was hired for the Building 7 cleanup, said that, quote, molten steel was found at 7 WTC, unquote. Leslie Robertson, World Trade Center structural engineer, stated that on October 5, quote, 21 days after the attacks, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running, unquote. Fire department personnel, recorded on video, reported seeing, quote, molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava from a volcano, unquote. Joe O'Toole, a Bronx firefighter, saw a crane lifting a steel beam vertically from deep within a pile. He said, quote, it was dripping from the molten steel, unquote. Bart Vorsanger, an architect hired to save relics from the rubble, stated about the multi-ton, so-called, meteorite that it was a, quote, fused element of molten steel and concrete, unquote.
In addition, it has been widely reported that Peter Tully, the president of Tully Construction, claimed that he observed, quote, literally molten steel, unquote, at the WTC site. It is possible that Gross did not know of this or other eyewitness claims, or that he would dispute the contention that Tully used the word pool, as he may not have. However, a line of defense that splits hairs in this manner would seem disingenuous, because Gross clearly implies that he does not think there is any evidence for molten steel at all. And it seems he does so for a very good reason. Continuing his response, Gross says,
steel melts at around 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. I think it is probably pretty difficult to get that kind of temperature in a fire.
Now that is something that both NIST and its critics can agree on. Such temperatures seem to be inexplicable on the official account. This is precisely why the multiple reports of molten steel, seemingly corroborated by video evidence, iron-rich microspheres in the dust, and so on, are regarded as troubling to many people. When faced with a serious question, Gross's response was to dismissively deny the free fall of Building 7. There is one significant fact, however, that NIST found it could no longer deny. So the officials adopted a different strategy, admit it, and then say that it doesn't matter. Let's begin with a Q&A session regarding the draft for public comment version of NIST's final report on Building 7. David Chandler, a physics teacher, asks the following question.
Any number of competent measurements using a variety of methods indicate the northwest corner of WTC-7 fell with an acceleration within a few percent of the acceleration of gravity. Yet your report contradicts this, claiming 40% slower than freefall based on a single data point. How can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside?
After asking for the question to be repeated, Sunder provides the following curiously irrelevant response, removing the copious hesitations.
Well, first of all, gravity is the loading function that applies to the structure, applies to every body, all bodies on this planet, not just in ground zero.
After eroding confidence with that baffling non sequitur, Sunder becomes more lucid.
The analysis shows there is a difference in time between a freefall time. A freefall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. And if you look at the analysis of the video, it shows that the time it takes for the for the roof line of the video to collapse down the 17 floors that you can actually see in the video below which you can't see anything in the video, is about 3.9 seconds. What the analysis shows, the structural analysis shows, the collapse analysis shows, that same time that it took for the structural model to come down from the roofline all the way for those 17 floors to disappear is 5.4 seconds. It's about 1.5 seconds, or roughly 40% more time, than for free fall to happen. And that is not at all unusual because there was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case. And you had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place, and everything was not instantaneous.
Sunder is saying that the building would take 3.9 seconds to fall 17 floors at free fall acceleration, but that the actual collapse time of that distance was 5.4 seconds, which is 40% longer, and their computer model also predicts 5.4 seconds. But this is not really responsive to the question, which admittedly could have been clearer. What Chandler is trying to say is, when one measures from the corner of the building, as Chandler did, the acceleration appears to be very close to free fall, at least for a certain period. And Sunder's response is, well, we measure the overall collapse time, from a point near the center of the roofline, to be 40% slower than freefall. Chandler does not have an opportunity to press the issue further, even his original question is asked through an intermediary, so he makes his case much more precisely on the internet, in a YouTube video. The period that Chandler is considering differs from the period on which NIST's 40% slower claim is based. This is because Chandler starts his measurement when the corner begins to descend, while NIST starts its measurement when a pixel changes color near the middle of the roofline, as the roof begins to bend inward, which is over 1 second before the corner begins its descent. That accounts for most of the difference from freefall acceleration. The mostly inward initial bend of the roofline looks like downward motion from the perspective of an upward-looking camera. NIST's analysis seems to leverage this ambiguity. Chandler seems to be suggesting that NIST used a single, perhaps artificially early, starting point, together with an unambiguous end point, combined with the assumption of constant acceleration throughout, contrary to easily observable fact. Chandler shows that a more detailed analysis reveals that for 2.25 seconds, to use the figure that NIST ultimately adopts, the collapse is very close to free fall. Indeed, NIST later admitted that during this period the building fell at freefall acceleration, 9.81 meters per second squared. During these 2.25 seconds the building fell over 100 feet, or about 8 stories, so this is no insignificant duration. In the final version of their report, NIST concedes that there was, quote, a freefall descent over approximately 8 stories at gravitational acceleration for approximately 2.25 seconds, unquote. However, free fall does not seem to be consistent with Sunder's own comments at the Q&A session, quoted above. Namely, Sunder had suggested that free fall can only happen when there are, quote, no structural components below, unquote, and yet, in Sunder's own words, quote, there was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case, unquote. Later, on a BBC documentary about Building 7, Sunder modifies his position.
It turns out that when you have connections that essentially don't have strength for the loads that they are being subjected to and you have this massive failure of a column, it does not take time. The structure has lost all integrity at that point in time.
It seems rather late in the game for Sunder to have come to this realization. Did NIST's computer model, which predicts a 5.4-second overall collapse, also predict that for a significant portion of that time the collapse would be indistinguishable from free fall? According to critics, quote, NIST's computer model shows no such period of free fall, nor did NIST attempt to explain how WTC-7 could have had no structural components below it for 8 stories, unquote. NIST does make a relevant though less precise claim.
His structural analysis model showed the exterior columns buckling and losing their capacity to support the loads from the structure above.
But is that sufficient to explain free fall? This is an issue that, one would think, should be subject to peer review. But NIST has not made its model available for independent scrutiny, and many requests for details have been denied. Although NIST has admitted free fall and has addressed its plausibility to some degree, NIST continues to stress that the overall collapse time is 40% slower than free fall, as though that was the most salient fact. Implications. Does the above entail that Building 7, at least, was a controlled demolition? No. There may be good explanations for the salient errant data. If the internal collapse pulled on the external columns causing them to buckle, assuming this can happen rather suddenly on all sides, perhaps they would offer negligible support. It is clear, after all, that the north face did bend considerably just a second before global collapse. Despite appearances, and despite Sunder's Q&A remarks about structural resistance, perhaps there is just nothing amiss here, and the conclusion that Sunder rather belatedly arrives at may be correct. As for the reports of molten steel, perhaps the eyewitnesses were just mistaken. But what of the corroborating evidence from the dust? There are two main issues there: iron-rich microspheres, thought to be indicative of a thermite reaction, and red-gray chips, thought to be unreacted nanothermite. Mick West is not impressed with this evidence. West is described on the dust jacket of his recent book as a science writer and professional debunker. In response to iron microsphere issue, West cites R. J. Lee, who wrote a report documenting the presence of iron microspheres in the dust. Lee explains.
What about the iron microspheres? The iron has a thin layer of rust flakes that can easily be removed by sticky tape. The iron is heated red hot or hotter and subjected to hurricane force blast furnace-like wind. The iron flakes are liberated as small particles and some iron is vaporized. Like drops of water, the iron flakes form molten spheres that solidify, and the fume also condenses into spheres, the most efficient geometrical form. The formation of iron and other type spheres at temperatures obtainable by the combustion of petroleum or coal-based fuels is not a new or unique process.
While that may not settle the matter for everyone, it is nevertheless the kind of response that is appropriate. As for the red-gray chips, West suggests they are just chips of paint. This was earlier suggested by James Millett and has been contested. Millett was hired to investigate the claims about these chips by Chris Moore, who opposes the controlled demolition hypothesis. Millett never published his report in any peer-reviewed venue. West also points out that the dust was, quote, missing an expected product of thermite combustion, unquote. He elaborates.
When we burn thermite, we find many white aluminum oxide spheres and a large number of hybrid eyeball spheres with a dark iron sphere embedded in a larger white oxide sphere. These were absent in the descriptions of the dust.
This is errant data relative to the controlled demolition hypothesis. Further, West did a little experiment. He used paint chips from a red-painted wheelbarrow that came off when he struck the wheelbarrow with a hammer. He says they looked identical to the chips found in the WTC dust. He explains.
When I heated them in a flame, they formed microscopic shiny spheres of some iron-rich material. It was magnetic.
Perhaps there are good responses to these considerations. Stephen Jones and others associated with the original article about the red-gray chips, for example, reject the notion that the red-gray chips are just paint. Rather than assuming they are impervious to reason, one should treat their argument seriously, respectfully, and with an open mind. Of course, nobody is required to spend any effort on this. But if one thinks that conspiracy theories are a problem, and thinks something should be done about them, the honest inquiry approach is much better than deceptive infiltration, such as advocated by Cass Sunstein, bogus experiments, such as those performed by National Geographic, or any kind of subtle manipulation. 2 levels of critique regarding NIST's analysis of Building 7. One can question NIST's results on a general level or a specific level. That is, one may question NIST's general conclusion, that the collapse of Building 7 was due primarily to fire, not controlled demolition. Or, one may question the specific sequence of failures NIST identified. The first line of critique, if successful, has troubling conspiratorial implications, while the second may not. But the second issue is still important. Why else would NIST bother trying to come up with a specific cause of the collapse in the first place? After all, a steel-framed high-rise had never collapsed due to fire before. So the precise reason it did collapse may have significant public safety implications. So, if there are good reasons to think their specific explanation is dubious, the whole matter may deserve a second look even if one cannot imagine that controlled demolition could be part of the real answer. Critics maintain that there are a number of technical reasons to think that NIST's specific explanation is dubious. NIST's explanation for the collapse of Building 7 involves a sequence of events tied to the specific structure of Building 7. The sequence depends critically on a single failure, that of column 79. According to NIST's theory, the key failure occurred when girder A2001 was pushed off its seat at column 79 by beams framing into it from the east due to thermal expansion of the beams caused by the raging fires. All of the rest of NIST's specific sequence of failures depend on that event, or so critics maintain. They argue further that there are a number of reasons to think that that would not have happened, some of which involve flaws in NIST's model. For example, they maintain that NIST's analysis omits the presence of, quote, steel plate stiffeners that provided critical support for girder A2001, unquote, and that, quote, the girder flange for column 79 could not bend or fail with the stiffeners present, unquote. Architectural drawings for Building 7, released in 2011 as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request, apparently show the stiffeners to be present. Critics also identify other purported errors and omissions that bolster their case against NIST's specifically identified critical failure. Both general and specific critiques of the collapse of Building 7 have recently been investigated by Leroy Hulsey at the University of Alaska. While NIST had maintained that Building 7 collapsed, primarily due to fires, Hulsey et al. Conclude, quote, fire did not cause the collapse of WTC-7, unquote. Further contrasting their conclusion with NIST's, Hulsey et al. Write.
It is our conclusion that the collapse of WTC-7 was a global failure involving the near-simultaneous failure of all columns in the building and not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building.
It should be noted that Hulsey's study was funded by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. It is not too surprising that his findings align with the goals of the organization funding him, just as James Millett's did on the other side of the issue, and one could say essentially the same of NIST's findings as well. The new study is unlikely to be the end of the story, nor should it be.
You have been listening to a modified excerpt from the Appendix, 9/11 and Epistemic Authorities, taken from the book Conspiracy Theories and the Failure of Intellectual Critique, published in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen. The appendix from which this material has been excerpted also discusses the following other issues: misleading media reports, a flawed debunking effort by National Geographic, problematic aspects of the 9/11 Commission, and President Bush's and Andrew Card's inaccurate accounts of what happened when Bush first learned that an attack was underway.